Today is Thursday, December 25th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. But we also have a special guest today. Mr. Smith, can you tell our audience about our special guest today?
I can. We have with us someone who's not been with us for a while, but it's always wonderful when he can be, Mr. Mark Sandor, visiting from parts up north. Mr. Sandor, how are you?
I'm doing good. Good morning.
Good morning.
For those
indeed.
of our audience that lives in the South, tell them where the congregations you're serving.
So I serve congregations in Minnesota, North Dakota, and western Wisconsin. So we left to come down here with temps in the single digits Fahrenheit and have been enjoying the 60 plus degrees and apparently even need for air conditioning at times here in North Carolina.
You're hitting a warm streak too. Yep. Like we're having some highs in the low 70s these days right now. So very strange. I mean, is anyone even alive where you are? Did you just leave a wasteland full of...
People survive. It's shocking. And of course, much respect to our Canadian brethren who are further north still. So,
yeah, well, we thought we would take advantage of Mr. Sandor's presence here there's normally just two of us, but now we've increased our ministerial brain power, whatever that might mean, by 50%. And we thought we would tackle some of the questions that have built up. Questions come in various ways, and we have a batch of them. And so we're going to try to hit a few questions today on the podcast and give you the answers. Thanks for waiting with us through the music. And, behind the scenes, Mr. Robinson and I, Mr. Sandor, were even wondering, should we make any jokes about the fact that it's December 25th? And, you don't know how much intense planning goes into each of these podcasts, at least a whole 5 minutes as we think about things. But, it's December 25th. And I will say, I never should have said it in my head, but... Oh, who said it first? One of the boys did. But driving into work today, the roads were, even the terrible roads of Charlotte were just good and clean. It was almost a 10-minute shorter drive. And one of the boys said it first. And so I literally was humming on the way in. It's the most wonderful drive of the year, which I never had because that tune just lodged right in there. In fact, maybe I've done that to all of y'all. I apologize. I should repent. But it was a nice drive in, and it is a nice time here in the office to get some things done. And Mr. Sandor, thank you for thinking of us and being willing to stop by. We mentioned the first time we actually tried to get the podcast going, it's been 2 years, right? A couple years?
Yes. 2 years since we've been out to Charlotte. It's I forget exactly how much over 1,000 miles it is to get here, but we have the rare opportunities to get here. So we're grateful to be able to sit down here when we can and visit other friends and family along the way.
Well, good. Happy to have you here for the Charlotte Family Weekend. I'm sure, I think you said y'all taking advantage of the time to, see friends, spend time with everybody. Okay, good. We'll try to treat you right before you go home. And when are you headed out?
We will depart for other family members' house. We'll actually be going further south to South Carolina on Monday, and then slowly work our way back north next week.
Before you go north to the frozen realm, you'll have memories of a better world, of a warmer place.
Yes, and they'll have to carry us until the end of April, roughly. But
okay, well, we do have your questions to answer, and so and we kind of have tied some together, some that do seem to be related. And by the way, thank you. This is a good opportunity to thank you for your questions. Please do continue to send in your thoughts and your comments. You can email us at podcast@livingyouth.org. Also, you can leave a comment on YouTube or comments on Spotify. I'm starting to see more of those, and I am doing better about paying attention to that. So these are questions that you have emailed to us or have been gathered. In fact, Mr. Sandor actually brought some himself. And so the first question is, why do you have to be baptized to keep the Passover? And, it might seem like a basic question, but it is kind of a good question. And sometimes people might even wonder what goes on at Passover. It's behind secret doors, what is it? But it is important. Why? Does anyone want to start on the answer? I could, but why does it you have to be baptized to keep the Passover? What is the Passover there to picture?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in and start by saying that it's one of the more unique biblically in that sense that if we have unbaptized members attending services, there's no other day that we would actually exclude them from. And as you mentioned, nothing about Passover is secret. We could go through the entire Passover ceremony on air and talk about the scriptures that are there. But sometimes when folks are approaching baptism or they're coming into the church, it's interesting how this one almost seems like did you call it like a gate that we keep or something along those lines?
Yeah, it can seem like a black box or why,
right.
Gatekeep is a good way to put it, because I've experienced individuals who are new, adults who are new to the church, and then they haven't baptized yet, and they do wonder, well, hey, why can't I do that? This is why I'm even here, is to do all the things. Why can't I do that as well?
And especially if they come in the spring and Passover is not too far away, to think, well, I want to take the bread, I want to take the wine. I see these symbols in the scriptures. Why would you insist that I have to be baptized to do so? But I think that's it, kind of interesting that obviously the Bible is what singles it out as being a specific holy day that you do have to accept the covenant to actually be able to enjoy.
Yeah, it is interesting too when before we get to the connection that makes it that much more obvious in the New Testament, even in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, when they kept the holy days, with various ritual washings and all the different practices, that everyone put leavening out of their homes throughout all of Israel. Everyone at the Feast of Tabernacles would dwell in these temporary booths and such. But even then, the Passover was only kept by those who were circumcised. You had to be amongst the circumcised of Israel, which was a physical circumcision at that time, in order to keep the Passover. So it really is kind of interesting. There's the analogy there for both of them, or it does carry over the exclusivity.
Mr. Gwynn used to talk all the time about when he would go very, very big picture, after the fall of man and the Garden of Eden, well, how do you have access to God? And so there were regulations around, like you said, the Passover, and that you had to be circumcised and all these different things. And that really, to some degree, still applies now with the Passover now. You need to have been baptized and received the laying on of hands, which were symbols. Well, it means a lot of things, but symbolizing your admission that your actions were part of the reason that Jesus Christ had to make this sacrifice for us. I know somebody said a long time ago, I thought this was a good analogy, that when you go to the Passover, the feel of it is kind of like a funeral, and we're there commemorating once again our commitment to Christ and appreciating his sacrifice. But the reason the sacrifice had to be made in to begin with was our sinful actions that required a sacrifice for it. And the Jews at Christ's time wouldn't get baptized. I did my Bible study on Cain, right? And one of the big attributes of Cain was never wanting to admit he did anything wrong, blaming everybody for everything else. Well, the Passover kind of symbolizes the opposite of that. It's an acknowledgement that we did do those things, and by the act of getting baptized, we take physical, tangible action and want to be cleansed and accept our role and our fault in these, again, the purpose behind Christ's sacrifice for us, and then, of course, the laying on of hands. And you can't attend a Passover service until you've gone through that process.
Right. That's
okay. Next question. Just kidding. Totally just kidding.
Did you? I see your Bible open, Mr. Sandor. By the way, good on you for having a Bible. Just so you know, we recommend Bibles here on the podcast.
Well,
we have on our
mine's
computers.
on my computer.
That's
Right. I was about to say. I think all three of us are in good shape.
So do you have? Is that open to Exodus, or is it?
It is, yes. So in Exodus, in Exodus 12, where it does make the Old Testament example pretty plain here, and we'll jump all the way down to verse 43, where it says that the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover: no foreigner shall eat it, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant may not eat it. In one house it shall be eaten, and you shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it." And so, kind of basic that you have to have certain requirements to actually keep this. The foreigners were not supposed to. But then here's the stipulation that, starting in verse 48, when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover, to the Eternal. Let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. And so he had to take that Old Testament symbol of the covenant. And I do like how it sums it up here at the end, because this is a theme you find throughout the the first 5 books here in particular, kind of a theme that I wish I had looked up more scriptures on, but that's okay. We can give homework. Go find other places in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, Leviticus, where it has this theme that one law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you. That this is just universal. That there is a God-given sort of gatekeeping that would keep somebody from Passover, but not permanently. They just had to accept the covenant through circumcision under the Old Testament.
Right. That really is the thing, that you have to be a party to the covenant. You have to agree to the agreement that God made with Israel to participate in the Old Testament Passover, which was it's the lamb. That is actually a picture of Jesus Christ. So it makes sense that you have to be a part of the covenant with Christ as well to take part in the New Testament Passover, and even circumcision as a picture. Deuteronomy has places, Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 30, where God talks about circumcising the foreskin of your heart, not being obstinate. It's very much a picture of repentance, of actually coming into repentance. And that's what we do when we are baptized. So why is baptism the where the line is drawn? Because baptism is when you agree to come into covenant relationship with Jesus Christ and with God the Father. That's when, just like Mr. Robinson was saying, how do you come to baptism? You have to recognize, I have sinned. I've got to repent of my sins. I've got to turn away from them. I've got to move from unrighteousness to righteousness, and I agree to allow Jesus Christ to cover my sins with his blood. I long to have them forgiven, and having them forgiven, a part of that is choosing to repent and wanting to move forward. The symbols, like Mr. Robinson said, the wine that you drink is a symbolic of his blood. The bread that you break is symbolic of his body broken for you in that covenant. You can't actually keep the symbols of the covenant if you haven't actually made the covenant. It's kind of like my wife and I will have this year our 34th anniversary coming up. And so on our anniversary, if we go to a nice restaurant, will it be me and my wife, and then someone, like a third person? It's not even a party to our marriage in any kind of way. Why would that be the case? Well, the Passover is very much a recognition of that covenant. And so therefore it is an observance only for those who are in that covenant.
Also some more of the symbolism. I actually did a sermonette on this a long time ago. It was one of the few times that I got emotional in a sermonette, but it was, you're commanded to take the lamb into your house for 4 days before the sacrifice was made. At the time I had young girls, and I was like, oh man, they would have so much fun playing with a little baby lamb and dressing it up and giving it a name. Yeah. And then 4 days later, Dad's like, so I'm going to have to kill this lamb now. But you take this poor innocent lamb that's done nothing. You kill it, you take its blood, you paint it on your doorpost, and when the death angel went out, the only reason you're not having firstborn die in your house is because you did it. You know what would happen if you didn't do it? You're still under the curse.
Yeah.
So the symbols are really, really quite beautiful in some ways, and really, I think it does such a fantastic job of explaining what we're acting out later with. How would I put it? Well, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And I don't want to move towards leaving this behind if you guys have something more to say, but I do want to add, because many of our listeners are young enough, perhaps they're not baptized yet while you're listening. I just want to highlight that does not mean that Passover is not a day is not a day of significance for you as well, because you're either baptized or you have a baptism ahead for you. You have that covenant ahead for you. And there's nothing wrong, and I would say everything right, with, if you're not baptized, still taking advantage of that time to meditate and to think and even to pray and to think about, well, what is between me and my baptism? Is it because I'm 8 years old, and I've got some growing to do? Hey, that's great, but it's interesting you're listening, as our podcast is for, older teens and young adults. But that said, if let's say you're 17, you're 18, you're 19, or for that matter, some of you listening out there might be in your 40s. We do have older people who listen as well, your 50s or your 60s. And if you're not baptized, well, then it's worth asking why, and meditating
What are you waiting
on that.
for?
Yeah. Now, some of you, maybe, you've got some maturing, you're just still learning, and you, regardless, it's also good to talk to your parents about that. Hey, what do I need? And this is going to bleed into the next question, by the way, that's come up. But I would just kind of highlight that. Don't think, oh, well, Passover is not really for me. Well, no, I would say that it's like in the Old Testament, Passover, that was actually a time when God commanded them. You see it in Exodus 12 and such, where he says, hey, talk to your children about why you do this thing. Why is it that you do this? If your parents there, don't think of Passover as your day, but in no way your children's day. It's one thing for you to meditate on your commitment to Christ, but there's also a wonderful opportunity to share that with them, and why mom and dad did commit their lives to Jesus Christ, and share that with your children as well. Don't hold that to you. So I would just encourage you to think of Passover more broadly, though the ceremony itself indeed is only kept by those baptized. You guys have anything else? I don't want to move on. No, you're glowing in wisdom. Let's move on to the second one, because it is related, and this actually question comes from Australia. I was going to say that with a terrible Australian accent, but I've decided to have mercy on all of our listeners. And this question was, how do I know I am ready for baptism? And that is a good question. People do ask that, pretty frequently. And all of us here have counseled people for baptism before. Have y'all ever had someone ask you something like that?
I did. I had a very young girl that I knew from camp, I think like 14 maybe. And the question actually took me by surprise at first, and I actually didn't even have a great answer off the top of my head, because I could understand, like, if you're a teenager and you're like, hey, I see this way of life, I love God's way, how do I commit, how do I be a part of this? And so it's actually pretty reasonable, I think, for them to wonder when they can get baptized. But I don't know. I shared a couple of stories, and I seem to have given an adequate answer, which I don't even remember what I said at the time. So I'm here anxiously waiting for you guys to help me understand why. Now, I know from my own personal experience, like if you're in your mid-teens, you don't really fully understand what you're committing to, and you need to be a little bit older to understand what you're committing to.
Yeah, definitely understanding is a part of that. What about you, Mr. Sandor?
I feel like there's a number of different ways that we could look at it, and I think even in our notes we have a number of different resources to help us out here, or help our young people out. I know for just trying to, the scripture that always jumps to mind is in Luke chapter 14 about counting the cost, and that's something that, to Mr. Robinson's point, is very hard to do when you're just 14. When you're more than likely at 14, if you're attending services, you're doing so with your parents and because of your parents. And frequently for myself, I know that one thing I want to see is that a person is independently choosing to live God's way of life, where they otherwise would not have to, where the parents' authority might, I hesitate to say have expired, but something along those lines, if as our young people turn 18, 19, they have more authority on their own lives, and whether they're going to obey God or not. And so as they choose to do that individually, that's usually a very good sign that they are choosing to continue to live this way of life. And I mentioned in Luke 14 where it said counting the cost. Frequently I try to ask them to go through that section starts around verse 25 and where it talks about, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. They just encourage them to start thinking, is this the type of commitment you're willing to sacrifice relationships for? Because that's frequently one of the hardest things we have to do. And it doesn't guarantee that you have to sacrifice all these relationships, but that you need to be willing to do so.
Right.
And that's worth thinking through very profoundly.
I had to do that. I was 23 when I started taking things seriously, and I started going through the Bible study course. I began counseling, and it took me like 30 seconds to figure out I was going to have to ditch about half my friends. And it's not, they weren't, by worldly standards, they weren't bad people. But for me to track in this new way of life that I'm committing to meant I was going to have to move on from them, which actually totally happened, and it was 100% of my old friends that I had to move on from.
Interesting. I really appreciate that insight, Mr. Sandor, because I too, it's probably pretty common for a lot of us to refer to Luke 14 and that discussion, right, starting in verse 25, kind of going down there at least through verse 33, about counting the cost, because I've heard them referred to as the three cannots. Jesus Christ literally saying, hey, unless you're really open to doing this, you cannot be my disciple. So clearly there are things we have to resolve. I've seen people out in the world trying to justify, say, infant baptism, completely dismiss all of these and saying that, well, no, baptism saves. It's important. You got to save them first, and this can come later. But that's just based on a broken idea that somehow everybody's going to hell after they're born, unless somehow they get dunked in some water or have something sprinkled at them. No, Luke 14, but that particular insight, because Jesus starts with that, right? And doesn't hate, and which we know means that you're willing to cast them aside for me. He's not saying you got to really hate them, because the commandment says you got to honor them, and you should love them. But that said, compared to loving me, you've got to be willing to take actions that would be as though you hated your father, hated your mother, hated your wife, hated your children. And you're so right when you're, especially all the more when you're younger, but I would say when you're older, it doesn't disappear. Your relationships are so important to you. And many people, when they ask, literally at a TWP not too long ago, there was a family that was just fired up about the things they've learned and the truths. And that was the greatest trial they face, is they recognized the moment they act on those things, they were going to start losing. They were already losing some relationships because they were acting on the truth they knew. And they kind of wondered, well, does that get less or more? And it's like, oh boy, really, yes, it can grow more. That's exactly what Jesus was talking about. But at the same time, at least, for that sake, you start at least gaining access to wisdom in the church of your fellow brethren who may have lived through such things and know how to mitigate those difficulties. But absolutely, that is a great question to ask. I also try, when some are struggling to know whether they're ready, sometimes I just encourage them to go ahead and just start counseling. That is, go ahead and talk to your pastor. Sometimes we wait too long to talk to the minister, and really what we're trying to do is to solve all the questions ourselves before we go. Like you're trying to decide whether or not it's time for baptism before you've even gotten the counsel from the person who's supposed to help walk you through the process. And in talking with one particular young individual once about that, I encouraged them. I said, why don't you, it's called baptism counseling. It's not baptism getting, it's not baptism signing up for. I said, why don't you go ahead and just counsel with the local minister, your pastor there? And he worded like, so what you're saying is counsel with him about counseling for baptism. I said, if that's the way you need to think about it, yeah, that's great. You could definitely do that. But just go ahead and enter that discussion. And the benefit of talking with your local minister is he's just that. He's your local pastor. He's been shepherding you. He knows you. He knows your family. You begin tapping into a resource there in your minister that God has given to you as a resource to work with you. And there's things we could talk here generically, but we're not your local elder or your local pastor, and they're not just talking with you generically. They've had a chance to experience you in the congregation. So I encourage you, go ahead and start the conversation.
Well, out there, even in the secular world, just think about the United States and its general practices about when you, at certain ages, what you can do. So, for example, you can't drive a car until you're 16. You can't even buy alcohol till you're 21. Now, you can debate some of these age restrictions. Like my dad actually got his driver's license when he was 15. We were just talking about that. So even the world recognizes as a teenager, there's just some things you're not quite ready for. And I think we can all say that the 25-year-old versions of ourselves was very aware at 18. We didn't know a lot about the world yet. And so It doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. It doesn't mean your inclination to move in this direction is wrong in any way. It just means you need to get to a certain age before you can actually get baptized, because you really do, again, kind of go back. You need to be old enough to understand what you're committing to.
Well, in many ways it is, because what we mentioned earlier, you're signing up for a covenant relationship with God. You're not signing up for something that you will easily be able to get out of. And frankly, if you try to get out of, has pretty severe consequences. And that doesn't mean that you have to wait forever, but you do want to get to a point where you understand what you're signing up for. I know that frequently for baptism counselings, and again, you don't have to wait. It's, as Mr. Smith was mentioning, you can already start looking at these things. But to review the fundamental statement of beliefs, I find to be so helpful for people just to review, what am I actually signing up for? What does the Bible actually teach? And the fundamental statement of beliefs is just such a brief way of doing that, at least getting a overview of so many different doctrines that might have to do with the covenant, might have to do with God's plan, our behavior, any number of things that can help us understand what we are actually committing to at baptism.
Right. And that's another benefit that you might get from talking with your pastor. He might know some very particular resources he would recommend just for you, if he knows things you've struggled with, et cetera, that you might want to consider. Before we go on to the question, and again, unless you guys have anything else, by all means, feel free and add it. But we do have a few resources. One, I would encourage you, there's a sermon by Mr. Weston that he gave in May of 2018. At least that's when it was posted on YouTube, I think. That was titled, "Are You Ready for Baptism?" ? So go listen to Mr. Weston. He actually does talk about that in his sermon. And then also, going back even further, there's a November-December 2006 article by Dr. Scott Winnail titled, "For Church Youth, How Do I Know When I'm Ready for Baptism?" So we have resources. We have resources. Go out there and take a look at that. Don't just listen to us. Take advantage of what the church has put together. Okay, that said, are you guys okay with moving on?
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question. Look at us knocking things out. We're pretty amazing. I'm just kidding. A dumb thing to say. All right, next question. And this is one brought to us. Appreciate very much. And that is, and I appreciate the way it's put, because I used to put it this way. The question, as stated, was this: how do you date without practicing divorce? And I like the way that's worded, because that's the way I used to even talk to when I was a high school teacher, talk to my students about that, when they were kind of paired off here and there, and of course they're breaking those relationships, moving on to another one. And I would say, yeah, you are, you're kind of practicing divorce, you're kind of pretending to be a group, and you're a couple, and you love each other, you say, but then next thing you know, you're moving on to somebody else. I said, really what you're doing is practicing divorce. So I like the way that's being worded. So is there a way to actually date and not be practicing that? Well, I also hope you guys don't mind. I say you guys like as if I'm vastly older than Mr. Robinson, which I'm not. We're about a year.
Year and a half.
Yeah, about a year and a half. So, but
we're much older than Mr. Sandor.
We are. He's but a wee babe. I'm going to use the term "going steady." It's an older term than us. I don't know, did y'all say the term? Did y'all say the phrase "going"?
Even when I was growing up, I was quite aware of steady, but even then it seemed dated. Like they would use it on Happy Days.
That's right.
And so we never used that, but
yes, our phrase when I was, at least by the time I got to fifth grade, the phrase was "going with." Like, well, who are you going with? So we didn't. I guess we got lazier. We didn't use the word "going steady," but we knew what that meant. They said, "Oh, Bobby's going with Sharon." Well, we know what that meant. They were exclusively dating, and maybe that's the phrase we should use.
I thought Ambassador College had a pretty good one, which was paired off.
There you go, paired off. So that they've kind of created a group where others aren't in access. So that's really what we're kind of talking about when you say that dating doesn't have to be that. The world is messed up with the world dating. I had a couple of parents come to me once and say, "Hey, I appreciate the sermon you just gave on dating, but just so you know, from what we hear from our youngins, they were hearing when someone says, 'Oh, this couple is dating,' they mean they're actually sleeping together. Yeah. They're doing the whole shebang, there, and it's like, oh, we got to be careful. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about dating. I'm going to
put you on the spot, Mr. Smith.
Oh dear. Okay.
You're pretty good. So I'm going to give you like a 75 to 80% chance. Okay. Do you remember that article that you brought to my attention some years ago that was very well done, that talked about how we date now is the opposite of order of how we should be doing things?
Oh, wow.
Because it kind of was like, you meet the person, go on a second date, and you're already hooking up.
Yeah,
and
was
then
it?
you maybe commit to being a girlfriend, boyfriend, and then maybe you move in, and then the last act is getting married, when it should really be the inverse of that.
I do not remember that. Boy, I would love to find that article. That actually sounds really pretty good. I thought maybe you were referring to another article that I read where someone was talking about what they did growing up in the olden days, if you will, was they actually started going out on dates, if you will, younger than what some people do today. But it was very careful, and their parents were very involved, such that they kind of had standing rules. Like, you don't go out with the same person more than once in a row, just to make sure you don't form inappropriate attachments early on. That it really was more about kind of social growth and such. And we'll get to an article that has been published in the Tomorrow's World about that. But I hope what we're kind of getting across here kind of early on, and I'll put it this way: the worldly tendency to declare someone your boyfriend or your girlfriend, which definitely I did growing up, not in the church. It's like, oh, that's so-and-so's girlfriend, that's so-and-so's boyfriend. That is just unhealthy almost across the board when you're just really younger. It kind of creates this exclusivity. So if you don't want to practice divorce, don't practice marriage, don't practice engagement. You're not, reserve those things for the time when it's time to actually truly be considering those things. And when you're young, you have an opportunity to experience a lot of different boys and girls. You have opportunities to go out socially with a number of people and to learn about, what do I like in a person? How am I actually a bad date? The last 3 dates I was on, the girls seemed kind of bored. Yeah. What am I doing wrong? I need to, you have a chance to grow. Why don't you focus on that?
I think the 1990s was, if I had to pick a decade, was the decade that normalized living together without being married.
I could see that.
Even into the 80s, there was still a stigma attached to that. And the 90s began to push back on the stigma. And so the reason I mention any of that is I remember it was kind of it's too strong to say it was a national discussion, but the debate over, well, you shouldn't move in with your boyfriend or girlfriend before you get married. And the reasoning was, well, we have to see if it's going to work out.
Right.
So you talk about practicing divorce, that's literally what you're doing. You move in with the other person with no actual formal commitment, if you think about it. You live with them for 1, 2, 3 years, and guess what? It's not working out. So it's time to move out and find a new boyfriend or girlfriend. That is practicing divorce.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson had talked about that in the past. We've talked about how essentially when you're just living together but not committing and married, you're essentially saying, hey, I'm going to stay with you as long as it's good for me, and you know what? That is not the attitude in marriage. So you're actually testing a marriage just to make sure that you're making judgments based on what you will not actually form a commitment on.
And the data is quite clear. It in no way produces better marriages. And then the data that again, I think it's quite clear. You get married, there's a notorious number, 7 years, 5 to 7 years of being married, and things aren't going well. And so then some conclude, well, I guess I've fallen out of love. So you get divorced and you're going to go find a new family or a new person and start a new family, and now you'll be happy. But the data is that those who got to that point, who stayed together 7 years later, were happier than those who had gotten divorced. They were never as happy. And just and then if you add like a third marriage, it just imagine how the statistics are going.
Boy, when some in those situations say, "Oh, well, I just fell out of love with him," I got to think, I have probably given my wife countless occasions to say, it's like, well, I don't feel like I'm loving him today. Boy, what a jerk. So, it's that would be one attitude, is kind of holding off on those things. Just because you have crushes come naturally, to be sure. Someone kind of starts to seem like a little shining light and you start to notice them more. And we do have a podcast on that, podcast 41, Dealing with Crushes. That is actually, if I recall, I could be wrong, I don't know if it's on YouTube or other things, but at least in one medium, it's one of our most popular podcasts of the past, is Dealing with Crushes. Do you have some thoughts, Mr. Sandor?
Well, sure. And I think in particular, since I know the person who asked this question, there's maybe a few nuances I'd like to explore with you all. So one of the things I've heard from some of the teens in our area is that they can understand that they don't want to practice things the way the world does. They see that the way the world dates is to be avoided. I think the struggle that they were trying to emphasize is, okay, so then what are the actionable items? And I know for me, one of the things I've tried to lean into, and I'd be curious to hear your two feedback on this, is about sometimes they do want almost those age limits, right? Okay, I've turned 16, I can drive. I've turned 17, now I can go on a date. But what does a date actually mean? And perhaps in particular for our young adults, let's say you are 20, 21, maybe you have been dating in a righteous way, but you just realize it's not working out. And so ending that dating relationship, if you've been doing things the right way, did you actually just accidentally practice for divorce? I think that's some of the things I would like to maybe discuss a little bit further.
Sure.
Because I do think that the last thing we would want is to be like, well, we're miserable dating. And we're like, don't worry, after you get married, just hang in there. No, a lot of times, well, then, yeah, that's the time to break off a relationship. And if you haven't been physically intimate, if you have been doing things correctly, the emotional side of it is still tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would agree with that.
But
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, anyway, but again, you might have saved yourself from a divorce by not pushing through a bad relationship that you discovered was bad while you were dating.
Right. Okay. That's a really good clarification. First, I would caution us to not think of quote unquote doing it the right way as meaning simply avoiding physical intimacy. That's just worldly thinking. The idea is like, no, we've been doing it the right way. We're not being physically intimate. Well, still, if you're when I say dating exclusively, I just mean going out with the same person only, right? I don't mean being physically intimate. I mean, hey, this is who I go to take to coffee. This is who I go to take to, name the burger joint of your choice in your area. This is who I take to the movies. If you're dating somebody exclusively, but you're not really in a place to be married or to pursue any kind of marriage, I would recommend don't do that. I would say I would not lump that into, well, I'm doing it the right way, because you can be forming those kind of emotional bonds with someone to the point that, yeah, if you were to decide, well, you know what, this isn't leading towards a marriage, then yeah, it is going to hurt ripping those apart. And that's actually, I remember, your wife, I remember one of her critiques of it's going to be really extreme, but one of her critiques of the, was the terrible shiny vampire series.
The Twilight series.
Yeah, the Twilight series. I remember because I read it I didn't read the book. I read her comments actually way back at a teen camp. And she was saying that, she could see her students at the time being enthralled with this because she referred to it as emotional pornography. Is that it didn't, the characters aren't physically intimate, but you know what? Emotionally, they were completely bound. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of practicing divorce, because it really is how you deal with your emotions in that time. The idea that you're going to allow yourself to be emotionally bound to someone and then rip that apart. I would say, one, before you're of an age where you really do want to start thinking, hey, I'd actually kind of like to get married. One day I got a job. Maybe I'm not making everything I could, but my vector, my arrow is in the right direction, because I don't think you have to have $1 million in the bank, et cetera, before you get married. Often what you want is a wife who's willing to work next to you, or be next to you and support you while you're continuing to build. Having your, as they say, having your work ready in the field, like the Proverbs and the Bible talks about, it doesn't mean the work is already done in the field. No, you want someone to labor with you in terms to help you build that. However, yeah, if you're 16 or 17, at least as we structure Western culture as a young man, you don't got any business right now getting really married unless you're an extremely rare, odd case and your parents have told you so and your ministers told you so. Don't trust your own instincts in that regard. Mine, let me just say, I was definitely not ready by then. And so don't be dating exclusively someone then. And doing it the right way, quote unquote, the wise way, would also mean not being exclusive then. If you're not ready to actually, truly commit and support a young woman, then respect her feelings enough not to keep bringing them into your relationship, because ladies, Mr. Robinson's talked about on the podcast before, very lean towards emotional ties with someone, and actually then respect her. If that seems promising, That's great. Talk to your parents, talk to your minister about putting things in place, making sure you do date other people, making sure you're not exclusive yet until you're ready for that. This might be a good idea to actually highlight the article we have on the topic, because Mr. McNair talks about that. In August 2020, in the Tomorrow's World magazine, Mr. Jonathan McNair has an article titled, "Should We Kiss Dating Hello?" The opposite of the book out there about kissing dating goodbye. And it's geared towards parents, but just because you're teenagers, I wouldn't say don't read it. I think you should read it to understand kind of what the plan is. He's trying to give advice to parents to help children grow in a right way, where dating becomes that tool that lays a foundation for a future marriage, not something that puts obstacles in the way of creating that. So that would just be one thing I would highlight.
Well, mine is a little more isolated. I appreciated what Mr. Sandor said in his analogy. And if you date somebody and for whatever reason there's a significant enough problem that you think, okay, I don't think this person is in my future, reminds me of having listened to the Dr. Laura Schlesinger show in the 1990s, like a lot. I felt at one point like I could guest host on her show if she was ever out, because after listening to her for a couple of years, 3 hours a day during, like, at work, I would go out. Well, I could listen to it at work. The questions become repetitive. You start to know what people are going to ask, and one of the common ones was, "Okay, Dr. Laura, I'm recently married. It's always fairly new marriages, couple years, and my husband," it tended to be the wives calling about the husbands. "My husband's doing this fill in the blank annoying thing, or this behavior that's actually, we would say that's probably not good behavior." And she would always say, "Was he doing that when you were dating?" And the answer 90% of the time was yes. And she said, "Why did you expect it to be any different?" And because the instinct that you have before is that it will get better. "Oh, I thought that would improve. I thought they would grow up and not behave this way or do this kind of." No, it gets worse. And so that is one thing. You talk about like avoiding a divorce maybe by making a wise decision. I mean, if you find something in the person you're dating that's problematic enough, assume it will be worse. And then it is perfectly. I mean, that's why we date, right? To kind of kicking the tires on each other a little bit, finding out what their life goals. Like I know somebody who kind of had an opportunity, but the woman was not so interested in family. It was more career oriented, and he didn't want to take that risk because he wanted to like having the family was important to him. Yeah. And who knows, that might have worked out that way anyway.
Right.
But that is the kind of thing that you'd kind of maybe like, what's something that's really important to you, and then the other person is maybe even, I wouldn't say the opposite, but not nearly as oriented that way as you are. Well, that's something you have to question.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Mr. Robinson. I should say there does come a stage where you do begin to choose to date more exclusively. Maybe you are of an age you think, I'm in striking range of a marriage. I'm starting to get more serious about it now, and I think young Miss So-and-so, I think there's a lot of potential there. I'd say my wife and I got to that point as well, where I wasn't ready to propose and wasn't ready to say, "Hey, let's go start counseling right now," But yeah, I was serious, and I did let her know that at the time. I said, "Hey, I need to be upfront with you. I'm kind of dating you with intention right now. I think there's a lot of potential there." But part of why it was not an engagement and we didn't begin counseling is because it really was just dating at that time. But there did seem to be an interest, and there does need to be an openness about such possibilities. But by then, like, I was of an age wanting to consider marriage. I was of an age, I had a job on the horizon. I knew that I was headed towards. That was pretty much a kind of a given. And so anyway, it was serious. And that isn't necessarily practicing for divorce. That's just being kind of upfront and being honest about that. But it is still a time of evaluation. Practicing divorce is when you you're making such, as you're treating with a level of intention something that you're not nearly old enough or mature enough to be able to actually pursue, which only guarantees a long period of having to, in a sense, be quasi committed to someone. That's really when it's a problem. But no, there should be a period there where, and also I would encourage too, if you do get to that stage, you don't have to, you can actually start counseling with your minister before you actually have a girl to bring. I remember a young man talking to me when he was kind of weighing a few different girls. He had kind of options. He did want to start pursuing one, but he was kind of thinking, and he actually counseled with me. And I personally encourage what I call relationship counseling, not just pre-engagement counseling or something. That is, when you really, just like you talk to your parents, if you have a young lady or a young man or something, and it looks like there's some potential for a real serious relationship in that way, like they could actually go towards marriage, then surely you're talking to your parents. Surely you're talking to your trusted advisors, and that trusted advisor would normally include your minister as well. So I'm not sure if those comments are helpful.
Well, let me see if I can jump in a little bit more here with, would we be willing to say that, especially maybe we tackle the boys first. I mean, usually if you're 17 and younger, you're really not at the place to be able to try to date exclusively. Like, you should just be trying to get to know people. You're most likely not going to get married before you turn 18. That would almost be, like you said, the way our society's set up. Just not one we'd recommend for most of our audience in any way. As they start to turn 18, the years will start allowing a greater percentage of boys to be closer to where they need to be and hopefully by that point I should stop calling them boys and just say young men, to actually be in a place to be able to support a marriage, and therefore dating would become more and more profitable at that time. I guess because obviously if the end goal is hopefully to have a successful marriage and to meet that person, you're just trying to advance all your various life goals somewhat equally, if you will, that while you're still, before you turn 18, you should still have education goals, you should still have career goals, you should still have spiritual goals and emotional maturity and whatever else that's going on during that time. And all of those various types of maturity will be progressing. And then I know for many men, a lot of times as we're maturing and growing up, God opens the door when it's the right time. And when we're trying to almost force that door open prematurely, that's where it feels like we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble, where we're actually not ready in another area of our life that some time and, again, either education, maturity, whatever you want to describe it as, will help take care of. And especially for most of our young men, sure, you might not be ready when you're 17, but by the time you're 21 or 22, there's a far greater likelihood that you're going to be ready for that. So I think maybe in some ways then you do have to just go back to processing, because as it turns out, having a crush on a girl does not wait until you're 18 years old. I think that might be right. the harder part of it.
I think there's one thing that we ought to at least mention if we're going to talk about this, is if you're going to date within your community, which is the Living Church of God, there's not a lot of, the congregations are smaller. There's not a lot of people there. And I would imagine if I was a 17-year-old person that was kind of beginning to think towards, well, one day I want to get married, I'd be like, but who? There's only one person in my congregation, or maybe there's nobody in your congregation, and then who am I going to find? And then it becomes a little difficult. Like, we say you should date a few people, but that is like so hard.
In the congregations I serve, it's all but impossible.
Yeah, and we should mention that, and I do think that that's part of one. I've heard some think, if only for the church it wouldn't be that difficult. And it's like, man, you haven't watched any mainstream commentary concerning what things are like for people outside in the world as well. In fact, a lot of people outside the world lament not being connected with some kind of church or something, because it is such a shortcut to having so many fundamental things important. And there are opportunities. That's just it. I would say some people kind of sit around waiting for something to happen versus trying to participate in camps, going to family weekends, actually doing those things, and being of a mindset to mingle when you do.
And I definitely want to soften what I just said, is that we have young people who are getting married in the church.
Yep.
Just because they don't have other people in their congregation on a weekly basis.
If you don't believe in miracles, that alone right there.
I mean, we've certainly had some who, are no longer in the Minneapolis congregation because they're married to someone who they met in the church, and they live somewhere else, and that's
way underestimated in getting married is the in-laws that is now going to be a part of your life for the rest of your life, whether you want them to be or not. I mean, that's some more, some less, but that is a huge factor. And I know people that married outside the church, and it's always a huge regret of theirs, or most of the time.
Yeah, and when I look at actually the statistics out there in the world concerning marriages, et cetera, and then I look at what's happening in the church, it's not like, why isn't anything happening in the church when so much is happening? It's like, well, no, I actually don't see that at all. You see people marry that it's not always people from the same congregation. It's people from other congregations, other states, sometimes even other countries. It's that, it's easy to think dismally about those things like that. And guess what? People in the world that aren't even in church also tend to get trapped in that kind of thinking, when the fact is, no, there are those opportunities there. Try and do the right things. Try and be a good Christian, for one thing. Actually, again, go and take advantage of the opportunities to mingle and especially when it's focused on actually just meeting other people and trying to show the rest of them a good time and be a good part of the group, instead of, I got to go someplace and find me a woman, or I got to go someplace and nab me a man. But yes, when you do get to a certain age, and it's difficult, it's so easy to want to kind of put numbers on things, but honestly, people vary so much. Now, you could have someone who goes through a good full 4 years of college and comes out of that, and man, they still shouldn't be marrying. They got some other things to learn. And you have others that even early in college, man, they're mature, they're ready to go. Might be a harder start to a marriage because you haven't finished your education. I feel we can't put everything into a box, but I don't want to seem like I'm beating a dead horse. But that's really why we have counselors in our life. The three of us sitting here at this table, we don't know you. We don't know your circumstance. We don't know your level of maturity or where the direction your vector is pointed and what your arc of life is. But you know who does? Your folks, your family, your friends. Got to be careful with friends. Sometimes they just tell you what you want to hear. They got to be those friends willing to say otherwise. And your ministry and others. And they can help you judge those kind of things. And if it's too early in life when you really shouldn't be that serious, be willing to hear someone say, hey, you and Susie, things seem to be going kind of fast. I'm not sure, this is really the right time for that. Be willing to be open to that kind of feedback and listen. On the other hand, be willing to someone say, well, boy, a guy like you ought to be settled down. We're so used to, maybe it's an Americanism, I'm not sure. We're so used to thinking of ourselves as just these radical individuals doing everything, when you know what? God has blessed us with the body of Christ. He intended us to exist and to think about our lives in the context of other people around us. And so that's what I would say, involve some of that thinking as well.
Well, so I like a good rule of thumb, though, that Mr. Sandor basically said was, if you're a young man and you want to get married, you need to at least have your house in order to some degree.
Right.
You need a job or a trade or an education or degree, something that's going to provide stability to your new wife. Because I know in this day and age, we try to pretend like there's no differences in the genders, but the women are going to want the security and want to know that you can you can provide a place where they can feel secure and then raise a family in time. And that's primarily your job. I mean, I know, my wife and I were both working because we were 23, 24. We're both working at the time, but once we got married, we continued to work. But once we wanted to start our family, then we made some adjustments to how we were doing things.
It's easy to push back because we'll highlight that passage that says, make your work ready in the field and then build your house. And it's easy to push back and say, well, how much money do I have to have in the bank? 10,000, 100,000, that'd take forever. And that is true. On the other hand, have a job, right? I mean, that's not the same thing as saying, well, it doesn't make, hey, can you pay rent? Are you actually able to take care of yourself? You know what? You marry a wife and they get sick sometimes. They actually kind of rely on you to even do some of the basic things. Maybe you need to make her dinner, for once. My wife is listening, by the way, be careful. But maybe you need to be able to do some of those things. Yeah, there is something to actually being capable of being married, and there are some fundamentals. Yeah. Mr. Sandor, you had a passage, it looks like, you found.
Right. Yeah. And it's one I think we've brought up, or I've heard at least you all bring up in podcasts before, and that's in the Song of Solomon, chapter 3 and verse 5. And I actually believe it's repeated other places. This is just the first one I found, where it mentions, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. And in many ways, I feel like for our young people, for our teenagers, you will start having crushes on people, and yet the Bible does recommend that a very strong admonition to just have self-control, to talk to your family and friends. And even though almost the irony is well, keep preparing for it. I mean, keep being ready for when the time is right. I mean, you do get to awaken it at some point. The goal is not, don't stir up nor awaken love. It should never wake up. It's like, well, no, you just have to wait for the time that it is until it actually pleases. And of course, the irony is, I know for myself with my oldest two being boys that it's easy for me to focus on the male side of things. That
right.
It's almost like, well, great, you have a crush, so go get good grades and go get your job, right. And be ready to actually support someone when you're able to be of age to actually follow through on some of these things. Because I do think it's interesting that even just being hardworking and industrious, some of your comments made me think of my wife and I, that I was close to being done with college. I was working basically full time at a restaurant, and it was enough to pay the rent. It was not enough to. It was not the long-term plan, but it was at least enough to say, yes, I can take care of myself and my spouse, and then eventually got into my teaching career after another year or so, whatever it took at that point. But yeah, a lot of times you just, as the years go by and as you keep preparing yourself, you'll find that those doors open all the easier when you're taking care of other aspects of your life, and then God opens up the right door for the right person for romance to blossom.
Yeah.
In summary, the real answer is you're never ready to be married. So do your best to prepare.
Well, and as Mr. Smith has said, I can't help but think it's so repetitive, but yes, just talk, get counsel, because there's so many individual parts that's almost impossible for us to delve into each little thing here. But that is why we have parents, hopefully those friends who do tell you the hard truth on things, and certainly in the ministry as well.
Thank you. And that brings us to our last question to go over. And I thought it's easy to think, it's so obvious, but I don't think it is. And I will say I've actually asked myself, even as an older fella, every once in a while, I've asked myself a version of this question. So the following question was sent in. How do I know what is okay to pray about? As in, if I talk about my problems and issues like I would to my parents or friends, is that too casual with God? And I did think that was a great question. And let me go ahead and get out of the way and then ask you guys what you all want to say. Is, we do talk about the model prayer. The world tends to call it the Lord's Prayer. We're trying to be careful not to do that all the time, because it's not something just to be memorized and recited rote. It really was Jesus modeling for us when his disciples said, hey, teach us how to pray. And he gave us this great prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. We won't go through the whole thing.
A good outline that some took and decided they just would repetitively.
Exactly. And yet you don't see anyone in the entirety of the rest of the New Testament reciting that. But in that model prayer, you have modeled so many things. You have modeled the humble attitude towards God, a recognition that he is the creator and he is great and he's capable of doing anything he says he's going to do. The focus on the kingdom, which is there. You have different areas modeled in terms of asking for blessings or needs for yourself, asking for others, making sure that you asking for help to be forgiving, because you won't be forgiven otherwise. Talk about trying to be kept from temptation. There's so much packed into that. It's a great model prayer. And there are times that I will mentally go through that, and if I'm, kind of settling in for a longer prayer. But this is where it does change. There's also times I don't. There's also times when I'm not going through every element of that. It's a little more narrow and a little more niche. And there's times I've thought, well, is that okay for me to do that? Well, yeah, if I look at the examples in the Bible, I see not everybody went through all of those phases, and yet those phases still inform us. So that said, before I say too much more, what do you guys think in terms of if someone, which someone just has asked us, how do I know what's okay to pray about? What would you say?
Well, now that you've brought the model prayer in, it's tough to go on without addressing the model prayer, because especially embedded within this, the most interesting thing about this to me in this question is, if I talk about my problems and issues like I would to my parents or friends, is that too casual with God? And that's such an interesting question. Now, I have a very definitive answer to that in my opinion, and just to go directly to that, it's like, you know what God wants with us? He wants a warm, intimate relationship with us, like you would a father. I mean, if a father was fulfilling his job ideally, that's the model we're given, so we can understand what our relationship like God would be. And there's nobody better than God to come. Like I actually would think it was a good sign if you kind of started your prayer and you had some things that were on your mind you want to talk about, and then it became actually more casual. I know they're worried about that. To me, that's not a problem. I mean, you're talking to your Father in heaven. The model prayer, the first thing you acknowledge is that you're addressing the Father in heaven.
Right.
Our Father who art in heaven. And remember that this is not just any father. This is the creator of all things, and then on down. And so I think, in my opinion, that it's a great sign when you become comfortable talking to God and you bring out what's on your mind and what you're thinking about, what your concerns are, like you would to a father, or if you're married, maybe your husband. For some reason, I've defaulted to assuming this is a girl's question. I just now realized. But it of course, it can be the other way around. But I don't want to go on about it. But I mean, I think that is actually would be a wonderful thing, that you're comfortable enough in your prayers to God to be like it's a conversation.
Yeah, but we'll harvest Mr. Sandor's thoughts here in a second. But I was going to say amen, but it seems kind of weird to do that we're talking about prayer. But that said, yes, it's literally the first thing in the model prayer where he says you're addressing your Father, our Father who is in heaven. But of course, we understand that in a way that many in today's world may not always fully like they should, that a father is someone that we do respect. This is not just you sidling up to your bro in high school and saying, hey, yo, what's your day like? I know all of you listening talk just like that, but we are talking to your Father in heaven. And that's part of what's kind of missed in a world where family relationships are losing out and where people see themselves forming bonds with, say, their classmates without having an earlier bond with their parents, where your first thought about, you're in say 10th grade and you got a big decision and you'd somehow rather talk to your friends in 10th grade than you'd tap into the wisdom of your dad, or your mom. So it kind of ignoring that dynamic and realizing, well, no, those should be your most intimate of companions, or the ones who've been with you from the very beginning, the ones that you were born into their arms and they've worked with you your whole life. And parents in those healthy relationships want to hear their children's trials or struggles. And I mean, I don't know anyone, I can't say that this would not be the case out there, but not in a good, healthy parenting scenario where their child comes home from something. It's like, I borrowed Susie's book and I can't find it. I don't know where it is. How many parents thinking, oh, just shut up. I got bigger problems than you do, kid. It's like, no, they, if anything, they're like, well, did you check your locker again? Sometimes it's messy. Did you look under the pile? No, you want to work with your kids. Mm-hmm. And so, I would think that definitely you go to your parents with your issues or your concerns. And when Christ says that, he's not meant to make this formal scenario out of it. No, it is very intimate. Yep. But yet it is intimacy and respect can truly go hand in hand. So, Mr. Sandor.
Right. Well, in many ways, some of the notes that you had put together for the podcast today almost was emphasizing this too, that I can't help but think of the book of Psalms as being a great place to go and see how David expresses so many different emotions. And I just would hesitate to say had a formality to it. It was more of just authentic type of relationship, and that was more important to him. Because how formal do you need to be? It almost sounds like you could practically risk being on the Pharisee side of praying rather than on David's side, which focused more on being just authentic and saying, God, you know what's in my heart and my mind anyway, so let me just go ahead and verbalize it and get it out. And I do think there is that balance to, well, there's times if I'm praying and really pouring my heart out to God and there's a tough situation and I feel like I'm just trying to let myself almost have a free flow of conversation with God, so to speak. There are times I might catch myself and be like, okay, and I am talking to the creator of the universe. And sometimes but I feel like that's part of prayer too, is to almost catch yourself and realize that, boy, this thing that is really bugging me or whatever it is, and that I might be trying to work out by praying to God and asking for his intervention. Sometimes it is kind of I hesitate to quite call it formality, but almost that recognition of like, this might be really small beans on God's to-do list, or this is a big thing for me. It's going to be important to God because he's my father, not because it's actually one of the like top 10 problems he's ever had to deal with. And but still letting, I'm as you mentioned, as fathers ourselves, when our kids come to us and say, they need to talk about something, but that doesn't always mean it's the fact that it's important to them is what makes it important to us. And that's,
Right.
and that frequently, again, is that benefit of trying to picture God as with the title he has, as being our father, and in the most healthy way possible.
Yeah, he is our father, but he is also our father in heaven. He's not like just this is the grandest of all fathers. And I like the way you kind of put that. There are times, and I feel like I see that sometimes even in the Bible. One of my favorite Psalms, because I'm covering it in a sermon these days. I think it's Psalm 73. I know I wrote that down, but now I'm kind of doubting it, but I think it is. It's that Psalm of Asaph, where he is just frustrated that he sees all the wicked doing well. It's like, well, hey, I know the righteous that are dying in their beds in agony, and I know the wealthy that actually are wealthy because of unrighteousness, and they're dying and they're happy and they're smiling and they're surrounded by family and friends, and all, he sees these things, and he's going to God about those things. And you see a mix of this, him being completely open with God about his concern and frustration, but also how he learned from it. And there is a difference of relationship. Sometimes you do go to your parents with the problem. They say, you lost Susie's book, as the case might be. And they want to help you with it, et cetera. But then they also sometimes will see you getting a little out of perspective about some of the problems. And sometimes they're not there to solve your problem. They're there to help you gain a little perspective. It's like, sweetie, I appreciate that you think this is the end of the world. Let me explain why it's not. That is why it's not just going to a buddy. It really is going to a father, where there can be intimacy and can be respect. One of the examples in the Bible that I remember hearing early on that encouraged me that God actually does sometimes really does want, that he wants to know when there's a small problem and is even willing to do something about it in some cases, is the example of the lost axe head in 2 Kings chapter 6. And that's where you had some work going on. And it says in 2 Kings 6 and verse 5, it says, as one was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. And he cried out and said, oh, alas, master, for it was borrowed. He just felt bad. Here's an axe head that he'd borrowed from somebody, and it wasn't even his own, and now it's been lost in the water, and it's there at the bottom of the lake or whatever, and they can't get it. It says, so the man of God said, well, where did it fall? And he showed him the place. And so he cut off a stick. You could imagine him grabbing something off of a tree. He says, threw it in there and made the iron float. And therefore he said, pick it up for yourself. You only give it so far. Now you just bend down and get it. And he reached out his hand and took it. Okay, it's easy to kind of dismiss that real quickly, but think of what just happened. The man of God didn't have magical powers. He wasn't like some sort of stage magician. The creator of all reality and the laws of physics, and who's been alive for all eternity, literally tweaked the laws of gravity or whatever he had to do there to make an axe head float to the top as an act of mercy towards someone who was upset that he lost something that someone had loaned him. Now, that said, God doesn't do that all the time, right? And I feel like it's kind of the same thing in our prayers. Like, okay, I'm upset that this situation's happened. Well, I do want to share it with God, but I also want him to have free reign what to decide to do with it, right? And then also part of that relationship with him is going to be a check on myself. Was this, and I got to admit, I've done this every once in a while. When I've reflected on my prayers over the last week or even maybe over the last month, and sometimes it happens during prayer, and I've recognized, well, I have really been kind of petty. I think I've just been coming to him with this laundry list of things all this time. And I used to do an exercise that I've tried to start doing again recently, which is every once in a while to have a prayer some part of the day or sometime where I don't ask God I do nothing but thank him for all the things I can think of I should be thankful about. But in those things, I guess going back to the original question, yeah, we should be willing to go with God with just about anything. I'm not trying to cut this to the end of anything, but one of the verses that really encourages me in that regard that I want to make sure we did mention is in 1 Peter, in chapter 5. In 1 Peter chapter 5, to me, there's this truly encouraging passage in verses 6 and 7 where Peter tells all of us, starting in verse 6, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he might exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." I don't think in verse 7 Peter is telling us to hold back on some of our concerns. God actually does care about our concerns, but implied within that is verse 6, that you're humbling yourself under God. You don't go with him with a bunch of demands. That's not respectful. You go to him with your care and concern, but it really is to hand them over to him for him to do with as he will. It might be for him to step back and say, well, you're doing all right. I think you'll figure it out. It might be for him to move heaven and earth and actually change something for you. Or it might be, at least for me, there's been times when I've talked with God about some things in prayer, and by the time I'm done praying, I've kind of figured it out myself, and it's kind of like, well, wow, thank you, God, for at least letting me talk with you about it,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway.
But I think that's an important part of praying.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes I felt myself doing it. Well, I'm not going to bring my wife into this. But you find you've kind of drifted off the prayer a little bit. But I think what's going on sometimes is you're kind of thinking through it. And you're right, and because I've had that as well, and you come out with an answer. Was that part of praying or not? I don't know, but you got your answer within the prayer, even if your mind drifted towards problem solving. But how is that not part of the prayer process?
I would think it is. The one caution I'll say, I want to hear from Mr. Sandor in a second. I can tell he's chomping at the bit, but I just want to say this: there's times when I also have thought of an answer while I'm praying, and I'm not trying to be a doubter. But I also want to say, okay, God, I feel like I understand the answer, but I don't want to take that for granted. Mm-hmm. Just so you know, I'm going to go forward and I'm going to do this, because I can already see someone saying, oh, the answer came to me in prayer. It must be the right answer. No, that still does require that kind of humility. So just keep that in mind. It's not a magical thing. Don't assume just because you thought of it in prayer that is the right answer. And yet at the same time, credit Mr. Robinson. One of the things I've said on multiple occasions, I don't know, on the podcast I've said so much, is I appreciate having Mr. Robinson in my life as a friend who's a real sounding board for me. And just talking to him sometimes actually helps me kind of work through some things and figure something out. And it's been a real blessing to me in that way. And sometimes our prayers become those opportunities as well.
Not to go down the mutual admiration club, but there's been more than a few times I've come in. I tend to will come in more frustrated about something, and I'll just start laying it out to you. And then by the time I'm done, I'm like, this is so lame. I know what to do. Hey, I do want to mention one thing. I know sounds like Mr. Sandor wants to get in here, but there's something we said earlier that I'm afraid some could take maybe too far. God throughout the Bible is constantly reminding us of just how powerful he is, and where he's being asked something or he's doubted in some way, and he says, is the Lord's arms too short that he can't, and so there's this, I really do think of that, an arm reaching out to go do something. I don't want anybody to, like, all of our problems are trivial to God. And I mean, like, really big problems, but from God's perspective, it's like, here, this is not hard. Here's how we're going to manage it, whatever. And so I don't want people out there to feel like, well, this is not a very big problem. I don't want to waste God's time with it. I don't want to bring it to him. When I would say, you let God make that distinction, and I would bring my troubles and worries, even if they're small, forward to God. I would mention Matthew, covering up my citation here, Matthew 11. It's one of these parables, and God says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And then come down to verse 30. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Like, what's a heavy burden to us is a light burden to Christ. So just because I know people do this. They think, oh, God doesn't want to hear about this. God's super busy. This is such a small problem in my life, and it only applies. I was like, no, I think you should bring it to God, because he'll make the judgment on that. Just one man's opinion.
Yeah, we've been saying, Mr. Sandor, is chomping at the bit or whatever.
Maybe he's not.
literally not squirming in his seat or anything. Just so everybody knows, I can see him in this thing. Like, guys, what are y'all telling him I'm doing here?
I know. I'm not sure I have any great thing to say that I was desperate to get out. But I will just say that the question also made me think in terms of like being casual. Well, again, comparing it to like my wife. What will annoy my wife is if we're supposed to have a conversation, but I am like checking my fantasy football lineup rather than listening to her, or if I'm, if clearly like, okay, honey, yeah, you need me to pick up what from the store, but let me just see if they score on this play, or if I'm prioritizing something else in front of her, if it is about me actually sitting down and addressing a problem with her, or we are having like, okay, let's sit down and work through our budget. That's where we find problems from time to time. And then one of the things is like to remove distractions. And I feel like sometimes that's also like, if you're going to pray, like, again, you don't want to pray with, hey, God, can you take care of this? And by the way, let me mess around on my phone. And a lot of times, even I know for myself, I haven't really thought about much lately, but it's, when I'm saying prayers, my phone has to be opposite side of the room. Like, it doesn't need to be around. It needs to be face down on silence so that I'm not distracted by it. I'm not going to try to have a serious prayer session with God while I'm distracted by whatever's dinging at me or whatever. But I do think also kind of one of the other things that you all had mentioned too is just about when you're praying or you're seeking counsel in whatever manner, how frequently the ways that we can draw close to God, they do bleed together. We have that great series of articles, or at least I remember them as being very good, with that I believe were done by you, Mr. Smith, and also Mr. John McNair, about the prayer, Bible study, fasting, meditation that they came out. I don't have the exact dates for the Living Church News.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago.
But they were wonderful because they are great to be able to see individually. But part of the reason I think that prayer frequently feels like we might have come up with a solution is that as we're praying, we are also meditating at the same time on it and hoping that God would influence both of those things, that he would be influencing the prayers and the meditation. And then, of course, if all the better if we try to think of scriptures where he would actually be addressing the situation that we have at hand, and to incorporate the Bible study part of that. So sometimes, when we are going to God and trying to work out these problems, if it does feel like your prayers go sidetracked because now you're actually just thinking about the thing, well, that might be you just transition from Bible study into meditation, and that's not a problem. That's not always
right. There's times when I've done
criticize.
that, and I've apologized to him. I would say, I'm so, Father, I got so caught up in that. And there's times I might actually cut the prayer short and say, let me think about this some more, and then come back with him, as opposed. But if it's in dialogue, then I might continue it in prayer. But the lines do get kind of fuzzy to time, but it's not so much the lines are fuzzy, is that they really do kind of feed each other, like you're talking about. Like, you can be in the middle of Bible study and you just read a verse that has kind of, gotten your attention a certain way. You want to say something to God about it real quickly. It doesn't mean you have to set the Bible aside and then go kneel for half an hour or talk. There's times I've just very quietly right then and there and say, wow, Father, why did this fella do this? I'd really like to understand this. And that's an interesting observation. Oh, and that was it. I thought there was you were about to say something more.
Nope,
that was it. Oh, okay. That's very good. I would encourage you. I appreciate Mr. Sandor pointing out the idea of the Psalms. And it's not just the Psalms. I have learned from, I've never done, let me confess, I've never done this as an active study. I've wanted to do it. It's been an idea, but I've never done it. Maybe one of you guys have. But to go through the Bible and look at every example of prayer by an individual. The Psalms really are a massive collection. And what you do see in that is, for our quite young questioner and everybody else, which, by the way, I think is a male, our questioner, just so you know, Mr. Robinson.
Okay.
So, yeah, I can't remember.
Maybe it's because I had girls, and as a father, I kind of
You tend to
default.
think of it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I do the opposite. That makes sense because I've just had boys. But the Psalms are great examples of individuals who are very, very, they're open with God, but respectful, recognizing they are kneeling before the one who reigns over the entire universe, but are still transparent, because I think it was Mr. Sandor said, it might have been Mr. Robinson, he already knows what you're thinking. He already knows he can see right through you, he knows. So there's no reason not to be honest and open. But also, just other prayers of the Bible, when you see people, their appeal to God, they're very upfront about their concerns or thoughts. Even actually the one-on-one dialogues. When Abraham, in a sense, if y'all go with me on this, when God has actually visited him in person, the one that would become Jesus Christ, because he's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and such, and Abraham is dealing with him and talking with him and saying, "Oh, forgive me that I should say such, but would you destroy it for if there were 10 righteous men?" He's kind of negotiating with God there. Well, formally, in a sense, it's a kind of prayer in the sense that there is his God and he is actually talking with him. And what you do see with him is being upfront. But he asked him, well, won't the judge of all the earth, do right? And yet you could never look at any element of that discussion and see any kind of, lack of respect. Jesus Christ has prayers that are recorded for us, and you definitely see an intimacy with his Father. You see him even, using Abba, right, which is definitely more kind of like saying dad. People kind of question that to some degree, but it definitely, there's a familial relationship there, but always filled with respect and with love, recognition of who he is. So I would, if anything, I guess I would fall back on the podcast we did about how if it's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. I would not let my fears about whether I'm praying right or not stop me from praying. I would risk doing it poorly to be doing it, because this is going to sound really stupid, but my ability to pray and my prayers themselves got a whole lot better once I finally actually started doing it. I know that sounds really dumb, but I grew up, I would actually, with you were like me, had not grown up in the church. Mr. Robinson, you did. I grew up literally just doing the now I lay me down to sleep prayer, quote unquote prayer. My mom taught me that because she didn't know anything else, I think, and that's what she did. So I would always go through that list. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, which is kind of morbid for a kid to pray, I ask the Lord my soul to take, and I would go through the list of the people I bless. The whole idea of actually having a real robust relationship with God and talk to him in prayer was something that was really relatively new to me, and honestly I kind of put it off for a bit, really, other than kind of formally praying. But it got better by the doing of it. So I don't know about how y'all came to feel more comfortable in your prayers, but I'm assuming you do at this time. But that's what I'd recommend to our listeners. If you're not praying, just begin, and I think you'll find you'll learn over time. You learn in the doing, not just in the listening to us about it. And I think that's it. We've answered every question that all young people have in the church. So thank you, Mr. Sandor, for taking the time to be with us. We hope you'll always stop by, and we hope you have a wonderful time while you're here in Charlotte.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Smith and Robinson.